Welcome to Amusing Jews, where we celebrate Jewish contributors and contributions to American popular culture. I'm Jonathan Friedmann.
And I'm Joey Angelfield.
Producer and engineer Mike Tomren is working somewhere behind the scenes. Amusing Jews is a project of Adat Chaverim, Congregation for Humanistic Judaism, the Cool Shul Jewish Cultural Community, and Atheists United Studios. Hey, Joey. Meet Fievel. In his search to find his family, he discovered America. Thus reads the iconic poster for the 1986 Steven Spielberg-produced animated musical adventure, An American Tale. As a child of the 80s, who also happened to be Jewish, this movie had a special place in my consciousness and continues to hold that place to this day. There was something pure and relatable about Fievel Mouskowitz that instantly made him a cartoon mouse as iconic as any other, including the one who got his start 6 decades earlier in Steamboat Willie. Today's guest has written a new book of poetry dedicated to Fievel, poems that dig beneath the cartoon exterior and expose layers of nuance and complexity.
We're delighted to chat with Andrew Burt, a poet, author, and lawyer whose writings have appeared in the New York Times, LA Times, Slate, The Atlantic, Politico, Harvard Business Review, and other publications. He's the author of American Hysteria, the untold story of mass political extremism in the United States, and a new book, Poems for a Cartoon Mouse. Andrew, welcome to Amusing Jews.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Your book, Poems for a Cartoon Mouse, is based on Fievel Mouskowitz, the Russian-Jewish immigrant cartoon mouse from the animated films An American Tale from 1986 and An American Tale, Fievel Goes West from 1991. What is your relationship with those movies, and why did you dedicate a book of poetry to Fievel?
Yeah, so I'll give you two reasons. One is intellectual, and the other is a little bit more personal. So on an intellectual level, I think Fievel stands in some really, really kind of profound way for what it means to be an American, what it means to be a Jew, what it means to be an immigrant, in the sense that everyone who was here, I shouldn't say everyone aside from the Native Americans, are immigrants. And so what it means to be an American is really the story of what it means to come from some other place and then come here, wherever here is, and then to learn and kind of to grow into this shared sense of national identity. And so that really is the story of Fievel. You know, leaves Russia, comes to the U.S., leaves his family, regains his family, kind of leaves with this idealistic sense of the future will be better, and in America there will be no cats. And it turns out, you know, the future is not immediately better, and in many senses the future is worse. And then he has to work, his family have to work to make it better. And so it's a story of a lot of dissonance, you know, idealism and then pessimism and belonging and then loneliness. And so I also just love the fact that it's a cartoon. So for me, there are really, really deep themes at work here, and themes that I think I saw myself in and continue to, and I think are kind of allegories just for, you know, the broader individual. And then I'll just say kind of personally, there is in addition to that, there's a very specific story where I must have been 3 or 4, and I was at some Jewish nursery school, and they decided to have us all watch one of the Fievel movies. And I had to be sent home from school early. I left sobbing because Fievel keeps losing his family. And on the one hand, there's the sense of adventure, and we talked about dissonance. On the other hand, it's really, really tragic. It's this kind of story about, for me, what it means to feel different, and also what it means to not feel belonging, in again, this profound sense. So for me, Fievel kind of embodies the complexity of the American identity, of Jewish identity, of growing up.
Enjoying the show? Click like and subscribe.
The poems in the book were written over a 15-year span beginning around 2006, 20 years after the first Fievel movie was released. Why do you think the mouse has stuck around for so long in your head?
So we know kind of how much Fievel resonated with me. And I think the reason it took so long to write is because as, you know, big events happened to me as I was not quite a teenager, but actually I was a teenager. This time spanned my late teenage years and then into my late 20s. And so I think for me, a lot of this was kind of Feifel developing. And you can kind of see it from the book and the progression of the poems. It starts with leaving your family, and then it goes through Feifel breaks up for the first time, and then it kind of ends with advice for cartoon adult mouse. And so there's this progression, and I think the poems kind of naturally evolved as I got older.
At times in the book, you're clearly writing about the movie character Feifel. At other times, you seem to be embodying Feifel. Do you see yourself in some ways as the cartoon mouse?
Yes. I mean, yes and no. I think the cartoon mouse is everyone. And so I would say it's actually really a story about how I view myself and how I view my own relationship to other people and I would say their stories. And so again, I think what makes, why Jonathan, as a child of the 80s, you said like Feifel kind of stuck with you. There's not any one component, I think, of his identity that makes him so universal, but it's all together. It's this kind of soup of different characteristics. And so, yes, for sure, I identify with and as Feifel at times in the book. But to me, also, Feifel is this stand-in, again, for what it means to be an American, a Jew, an immigrant, part of a family, an optimist, someone whose ideals keep getting crushed. So there are all of these things. And so I would also just say in my mind, there's not a single Feifel. There are many Feifels. And so I try to capture, I guess, a lot of those different components and angles and dimensions in this book.
Yeah, I've been thinking a bit about his character design. And, he has that outfit that is much too large for him, that very kind of soggy hat. He's obviously, lower working class, if that. And I think there's something about a cartoon character that is not presenting affluence, right? And it is an easy to relate to story because there is, in some sense, that rags to riches and yet never really getting the riches. It's almost more realistic than other stories of that genre. And to me, anyway, the relatability is also in just the way that he looks. Look different from Mickey Mouse and other kind of self-confident cartoon characters that you might see on a Saturday morning.
Yeah, in many ways, he's both, again, like full of hope for the future and deeply broken. Like you can see bad things happen to him. He's wearing like hand-me-down clothes. At some points they kind of look like rags. And so there's some deep realism. And again, like this sense of dissonance. It's a cartoon. It's funny. It's happy. It's kind of like light. And for kids, this is why my nursery school had 3-year-olds watch it. But then if you look beneath the surface, it's really anything but. One thing that I forgot to mention, and this doesn't actually like pertain to my life now. I live a very comfortable life, feeling fully American and integrated. And I kind of have two strands of family history. One is kind of the southern part of my family, and they've been here for 200 years. The other part of my family came from the Northeast and had kind of a similar situation to Feifel. One of them actually even came to the U.S. from the Ukraine, got sent back, and then came back again and actually was an orphan. Another was, I believe, like a tailor, some type of skilled profession. Their boat sunk on the Atlantic. They got rescued and they lost all of their like machinery, whatever it was they planned to kind of set up shop. This was, I think, in the early 1900s, actually really like around Feifel. And they came to the U.S. And got a really, really terrible manual job and then died of some health complication from like, having to work underground. And I'm not sure exactly what it was. And so anyway, that sense of deep hope and, life is going to be better. And then they come here and they're like, oh crap, there really are all these cats. And yet, their descendants live in a world where there are, not as many cats. And so again, just the sense of dissonance that kind of pervades Feifel, I think, is something I kind of feel and encounter all the time.
Just out of curiosity, are you familiar with the 1992 animated series, Fievel's American Tales, or the third American Tale movie, a direct-to-video 1998 release The Treasure of Manhattan Island, or the fourth, The Mystery of the Night Monster, released to video in 1999. I mean, it is kind of amazing how this became a franchise. What do you think accounted for the mainstream appeal of a Russian Jewish immigrant mouse?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's been a long time since I, frankly, watched any of these, and like what you just kind of described, it's been even longer. Maybe in some weird sense, I'm part of that like long, franchise. I do think it's unique to have this type of depth kind of packaged in something that is so playful. And so you can experience this in a bunch of different ways. And I would say I can't think of many other cartoons for children that have this level of depth. Obviously there are other cartoons and graphic novels, Mouth is a good example of Jewish themes, but that is very clearly not for kids. Very clearly not for kids. And so I think it's this kind of dual appeal that's resonated.
Your poem, Mouse's Mask, reminds us that cartoon mice have a long history, whether it's Mickey Mouse, Jerry from Tom and Jerry, Pinky and the Brain, or Art Spiegelman's Mouse. You write that Mouse is not new, but neither is Mask. Could you elaborate?
This is not just about a single mouse or, many mice. I think the idea is we use masks and also fiction and stories in some kind of profound sense to hide. It gives us, and in hiding, I think we have a freedom to say what we really feel and think. And so on the one hand, this type of fiction is a lie. We're lying when we wear these masks. And in some sense, our identity is a lie. Our identity is some kind of static, unchanging mask, some story that we tell ourselves in the world. This is who we are. But of course, that's not actually, how we as humans work. We are way, way, way more than stories. And in fact, in any one moment, there's a lot more going on than, some story. So I think stories are in some sense a lie. And in another sense, they give us a window into something much deeper. Mouse is very much a mask. And my point here, or one way to read this, is that Feifel is not the only mouse to kind of perform this function, or the mask. I referenced the famous Pirandello play. Mouse itself, the graphic novel, is another. Tom and Jerry, Pinky and the Brain. Some of them are a little bit more playful than others, but and I think there's a specific reason why it's actually mice. They're cute, they're furry. We kill them all the time in lab experiments, and so I think they also, in some ways, symbolize frailty and mortality. I believe even The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, mice are actually kind of our overlords. They might be. I think it's actually mice that are the most powerful creatures in the universe. So there's a lot there. Again, there's kind of something cute and light and playful about them, and underneath also a lot more going on.
I've come to see An American Tale as our generation's Fiddler on the Roof, a one-size-fits-all story connecting us to Eastern European Jews, the ancestors of many American Jews. Fiddler on the Roof ends with the Jews leaving their Russian village, and An American Tale begins in some sense with those same Jews presented as mice arriving in America. While both stories have been criticized for homogenizing, romanticizing, and even over-universalizing these narratives, your poems pick up on the very real theme presented in both of expectations versus reality in a chaotic and fast-changing world. What's the role of optimism and its discontents in the immigrant experience, and maybe in life in general?
It's kind of odd that I think like the word that keeps coming up in my mind throughout this discussion is really dissonance. You can't have immigration without some form of optimism. The idea is I will leave where I am now in order to make things in the future better than the way they are for me, here. And so it may be fear that is driving people to immigrate. But in some sense, there has to be optimism. As bad as things are right now, if I leave, they will somehow be better. And yet, the story of Feifel and many story of immigrants, the story of my family, and frankly, the story of many, if not most Americans, you think about what it means to go westward across the plains, the Oregon Trail, and the great, video game that we all played in, whatever it was, third or fourth grade, was really horrific, really, really horrific. And people did that because of the hope they had in the future. And so you can just think about the comparison between these two, this ideal that everyone is working towards, and frequently this really ugly reality. And in fact, I oftentimes think, and I've been thinking about this and writing about this for a very long time, about what it means to be an American in general, and then also what it means to be an American today, where our national identity is very much fracturing all over the place. And I think one of the things that still connect us is there's some faith in our ability to work to make things better. There's some faith in the ability of technology to, in many ways, save us and make the future better. And I'd say recently, in the last 10, 20 years, I think a lot of that faith has been challenged. But I still think it's there. And I think we're kind of arguing over what progress means, not over whether or not it's possible. But even there, we have this fundamental tension of we are going to believe in a future that is better than the present. And yet, in some ways, idealism, I would say always falls short. We can call that the human condition. We can call it, the naivete of the present, whatever it is. But there's this tension. We need some type of vision, not always utopian, but, utopian visions help. We need some type of vision to drive us forward to make that progress. And yet we never get there. And so there is some sense of falling short. There is some sense of failure, even in the big achievement. And so again, that's kind of what I see in Feifel.
Do you think there's also kind of the discontent or disaffection that happens when we're moving into the progressive future, and there are all these disappointments, and then that triggers a sense of nostalgia, right? Because I know that Fiddler on the Roof was very much a nostalgic product that, despite how difficult the life was being portrayed, it was almost like a longing to return to those simpler times. It seems to me that there's a sense of kind of longing for the past as we're moving into the future as well.
Yeah, it's super bizarre, honestly. And when I think about it, I always think it's pretty ridiculous. There's always this nostalgia. There's always take me back to when things are better. But with very few exceptions, the past is never better. I mean, we hear it all the time, especially now. There's this real sense of the world is ending. And things are never good. There have always been bad things. Even if you look at Fiddler on the Roof, the romanticized existence is not good. Like, there's a lot that is really terrible there. I mean, I would just the pogroms would be the easiest thing to pick up. But it's something we see all the time. And in fact, in the moment we're living in, that's one of the key selling points for a lot of authoritarianism, which is kind of follow me, do what I say, join my movement, and I will take us back to some glorified path. And so there's this very bizarre sense of we're going to regress because right now is so dissatisfying. There's something wrong with the present that is so severe that we need to return. But I would actually say, and my own intuition and experience and my own reading of the history is that's really just kind of taking advantage of this perpetual discontent that itself, I think, is a product of idealism. And so it's a really perverse move, but it's alluring. It's really alluring, and that's why I think these movements can kind of capture the psyche of so many people. But I am here to say, the book of poems is here to say the past is not that great, and we always kind of have to navigate this tension between our idealism, which drives us forward, and then the sad reality that we're not going to meet that idealism.
It's an important message, Could you give our audience a taste, a flavor of your book? Maybe read a poem or two?
Yeah, I'll give you one that comes at the beginning of the journey. So this is Feifel's on the boat, getting to Ellis Island. And as they're getting there, the idea is Feifel sees a weeping willow kind of on the riverbank overlooking the water. And so there are 3 sections. So section 1, and this is entitled aptly, Passing by a Weeping Willow on the Riverbank. There's grace to your failure, or perhaps it is simply your pride. Your leaves, like clumps of pulled hair, pitted against gravity's tug. Section 2. And again, this is all to the weeping willow from Feifel's perspective. You'll be forgotten, but so too will your forgetters, and the rain will come down as it comes down now, illuminating the water and the grass in a temporary wet film. Section 3. Therefore, sleep and tower above the river as it passes and wilts and sway, and do not let the wind unhinge whatever it is you believe your hands refuse to let go. And so the idea, again, is some type of resistance to the future, some type of deep anchoring in the present. Weeping willows kind of bend to gravity, and at the end, kind of allusion to the fact that even at their bending, they do not break.
I love that line. You'll be forgotten, but so too will your forgetters. I think sometimes we get so caught up in legacy and are we making an impact? Will the next generation remember us? But ultimately, everyone gets forgotten at a certain point. Is there something personal there with the way that you see the world, or is it just sort of a interesting way of phrasing this particular idea?
I think we live kind of worshiping this notion of celebrity, that you can somehow attain some fixed point where, no one will forget you, where what you do, who you are is somehow permanent. And I think in many ways, saying even the people who forget you will be forgotten, with very few exceptions. No one can name the celebrities from the 1920s or the 1930s. And even right now, Marlon Brando is a good example. There are a bunch of others, from the 50s and 60s and 70s. But again, in 20 years, in fact, I work with people who are in their early 20s who don't know who Kramer was from Seinfeld, which I can't believe. Very soon, people will not know who Jerry Seinfeld is or what the show was. This notion of impermanence, I think, is really important.
Someday in the future, people are going to ask, was Taylor Swift a man or a woman?
It's entirely possible. They might not even know, enough about who she was to ask.
An American Tale was recently made into a stage musical, which I'm told foregrounds the family's Jewishness in a way that the movie wasn't really able or willing to do. Overtly ethnic content is much more visible, acceptable, and even expected in today's entertainment than it was in the 80s and 90s. Do you think we could see a new 21st century iteration of the Eastern European Jewish immigrant story that captures the collective imagination in the way Fiddler on the Roof and An American Tale did?
This book of poetry, and a lot of my thought relates to what it means to be a Jew and whether or not being Jewish is actually a thing. But I will just say that when we think about Judaism and Jewish identity, you could say there's a spectrum. You could say it's a mix between some type of like ethnic identity and commitment to some type of religious, ideal. But even when you say it's a spectrum, you could also say that it's a bunch of disjointed visions about how to live life and, stories about your connection to community and your connection to yourself. And so I would just say, I don't know. I personally don't know if Judaism is a culture, an ethnicity, a specific type of prayer, a belief in a specific type of God. It may be all of those things, but I don't know. And I would say, if I had to predict, just based on what I sense about the present moment, I would expect a lot of future stories about the Jewish experience to really deconstruct what that means. I would expect it to be more and more bizarre. The stories we tell ourselves about immigration and identity, I would expect people to try to break them down. And so again, rather than thinking about the nostalgia of these past stories and how they're going to kind of return, I would expect a lot of this to be reinvented. And I kind of hope I'm some weird, bizarre part of that. But I don't know. That's part of the exciting thing about, future and art and, where all of this is going.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Andrew, for joining us. It's been great.
Yeah, happily. Thank you again for having me.
And to our audience, now back to your regularly scheduled lives.
Amusing Jews is here to amuse you. If you like being amused, go ahead and click like and subscribe.